Okay, so please note, this is going to be a history of navigation. Not a in-depth going through the science of navigation, because honestly, if I was going to do that, and if I was going to go through the different components and things you use, I have a presentation on that I can give, but I have props. Because the place I go to give that presentation, they have things I can use. I have a very nice laser-based internal navigation system. I have a GPS receiver I can play with, and a couple of them I can play with and give to people to move around with. I have a sextant, and I always brush up and make sure, because I use a sextant about 4 times a year. So please note, I do not claim to be amazing with a sextant. I use it twice at sea a year and twice in these presentations. So usually for about a week before I give the presentation or I'm going to use it, I get it out and I'm doing my fixings, checking the horizon, checking the site position of the sun, or checking the moon, checking the horizon, checking the position of the moon, or occasionally I'm doing various things with stars when I feel like being trying to be very, very clever. And it's lovely. But again, that's a different scenario that I'm doing today. This is a history, not a history in science. So, if you're looking for a how-to video on how to use those things, type that into YouTube and find it. This is a history of navigation, of how navigation has evolved, and how, to an extent, navigators have evolved. And there is a scenario going here that navigators have evolved. It was, when it started out, a dark and mysterious art. And when I say started out, in our sort of understanding of records, it is a dark and mysterious art. There's a lot of magic in it. If you consider, if you've never seen a compass before and suddenly you see something which is being used as a compass, with a nice bit of, metal, nice bit of iron on a pool of water floating around, a needle, or anything else. It's magic. And navigators, they're seen as magicians. Even when you get into the age of sail, when navigation is being taught to people, it's being taught. The number of people on a ship who can actually navigate the ship are few and far between out of a whole crew. All the midshipmen, all the master's mates, theoretically some of the other senior NCOs, some of the warrant officers, i.e. the master, but often the gunner as well, because the gunner could be used to take command of a ship, as they were technically an officer, so they could be technically sent to command a prize. Surgeon didn't really need to. Captain, First Lieutenant, Lord Lieutenants had to pass their examinations of navigation. Midshipmen were in training. And then we consider the expense of the equipment. A sextant wasn't cheap. It really wasn't cheap. And that could also decide who would command a prize. Why send an officer with a broken sextant, or without a sextant? You send someone who has managed to get one, has afforded one. And being commander of a prize and getting her home, that's profit. All these things can help. Help you with your career, help you get promoted. So navigation is pretty darn critical. There is some interesting stories of navigation. There are tales from the Vikings reaching potentially North America, and how they, for want of a better phrase, chucked carved logs into the water and followed them. And the gods took them to safety, and they saw land. I look at some of those stories and I go, I know what you're trying to describe in a very romantic way. And that's part of the joy of history sometimes. First rule of history: there is usually a kernel of truth somewhere in a myth or a romantic story. Very rarely are these stories completely fabricated. And people are going to go, well, Alex, what about fighting dragons and all this? Again, it could have been alligators or crocodiles, but also sometimes the animals will grow up or will change because that's no longer scary. A dragon, a huge mythical fire-breathing beast, is always scary. Wolves, well, we haven't had wolves in the UK for a long time, they no longer seem so scary, do they? Think about that. A wolf is a theoretical thing, but it's basically your nearest thing you can see to it is a wild dog. And dogs aren't scary. You know that one which nicks food regularly. It's called Zebedee in our house. The poodle begs for food. Zebedee. I've been banned from bringing back any kangaroo biscuits from Australia. Because, well, if I do, it's worried that he will literally clear all the plates. He's just too good at pogoing on his tail. So, some of history you have to take with a bit of a pinch of salt. Or rather, you have to sit there and think, what could they be describing? What linguistics, and what are linguistics describing here in Let's Survive Through Translation? You know? And also, we have to let people tell us what they are doing. It's one of the most silly things you can do in history, is believe people are lying the whole time. They might not be telling you what you would consider the whole truth, but they are usually telling you a version of the truth. So, for example, if you find a race and you hear all these other races going, we banded together against these potential conquerors who seem to be dangerously powerful, who were, dangerous conquerors. And he looks at the race and thinks, actually quite small. They didn't really conquer anyone. Seem to be fairly technologically advanced. Well, the answer might be that rather than actually being conquerors, because they were technologically advanced, they were perceived as potentially conquerors. And they scared people. So they banded together to protect themselves from their perception of the threat. And instead of potential conquerors, in history they wrote down them as actual conquerors. And possibly they did win a few battles. If you want to look at a good example, let's look at the wars between Sparta and Athens. Honestly, don't take this the wrong way, neither state are that amazing. Okay? Both of them have their own major issues. But the perception of Sparta is as this militaristic state. You know, that all they were was an army. All they were is an army. And Athens as this democracy, philosophy, etc. You start studying them, and you find A, that Athens has a fairly decent military as well, thank you very much. Otherwise, how do you think they won the war? How do you win a war without a fairly decent military? Mostly, it's quite heavily maritime in focus, but they have a fairly decent military they've invested quite a lot of money in. And you go back to look at Sparta, and you find that they have a form of democracy. They have, it's basically an oligarchic version of democracy, i.e., the people who have served and who have lived long enough get a say in how things are run. Okay? Not that great, but, you know, it's look at the period it's in. And they also have a bit of a navy. And they also have some artistry going on, some philosophy, some wider discussions of science. In other words, they are not as single-dimensioned as we might be led to believe by their history, and neither are the Athenians. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's great when you learn that's the case. That's one of the reasons why it gets very interesting when we start getting into certain areas of history and science. And one of the things that I do enjoy is looking up and talking about, as said, marine navigation. Now, as said, when I give this talk in the place I usually give it, I have access to props. In this talk, I just have my slides. I have tried to find some things which are similar to my props. Now, of course, the historical navigation, the easiest one is coastal navigation. Why is coastal navigation so easy? Because it's literally go out, turn, port and starboard. If you raised up in a naval-leaning family and you learn port and starboard before you learn left and right, good luck, you're in the same boat as I am. You have to think, hang on, port is left, they're both four-letter words, and starboard is right. And hey, look, I failed my first driving test because I was very worried doing the driving roads, and the guy kept using left and right, and I was getting them, ooh, what's going on here? And then the next one I had test was, I went, oh yeah. I went, do you mind using port and starboard? I went, oh no, I'm a sailor. I love doing sailing. And so I passed my driving test with with the examiner going port and starboard the whole way through. It was brilliant. I think it's legal. I've been driving around for a while since. Now, again, we have a lot of history. Coastal navigation. But that isn't really enough, because slowly you start to go, well, hang on, we're going round a lake. I know I've always learnt the quickest way between points A and B is a straight line, so I will go straight. Not always the quickest way between 2 points when you're discussing marine navigation. In fact, rarely is a straight line the quickest way between 2 points. That's probably freaked you out, hasn't it? We'll get into that. Now, as time goes on, people start to develop sea routes, and it's one of the interesting things about history is that we keep going back further and further. And this is why I love naval history, right? Because we We don't divide things up into periods quite so solidly as any other group of history. Every other group of history has this sort of very, very strict. This year is this start of this period. This is the medieval period. This is the Renaissance period. This is the prehistoric period. Da 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 da. In naval history, we just go. As a rule, the things sort of overlap for about 50 odd years, minimum. I mean, there was technically a shipbuild line fighting in the Battle of Lissa. And, yeah, there are a few of them still floating around and serving in various functions, even in when HMS Dreadnought into service. So, yeah, it gets iffy. We like to try and keep up with the Joneses by having our own specific ages, but they don't really work. And that's why we sort of say things like, well, the Mediterranean sea routes have existed since the Neolithic period. They could well be earlier. Honestly, there are things like crossing the Black Sea, crossing the Mediterranean, crossing the Arabian Gulf a little bit, doing some coastal trade in the South China Sea and those sort of Indonesian waters, the East China Sea, going back and forth between Japan and China, the Bering Strait at various points, depending on its temperature. We know people have been crossing it. We know trade has been going backwards and forwards. We can follow the stuff. So in nicest way, they had to do something to get across. To get from A to B, they have to have been navigating. Because, and this might shock you, going off into the great unknown, guided by heart, is difficult. And also, there's the fact that we know countries and places and key cities, especially coastal, were building things like lighthouses from a very early time. The thing is, if you're building a great lighthouse, that means probably you've had other lighthouses before that, and that means probably if a ship's already knows what to look for, then probably lighthouses of some kind are fairly common. Beacons or lighthouse systems are fairly common. And we can find examples of ports of key places maintaining such beacons from quite an early period. Now here's the interesting thing. How do you maintain a beacon? Well, you need to have a supply of wood, because it needs to be burnt every night for a long time. And you need to have someone there to watch it burn all that time, and that's probably going to be a couple of someones. And as a rule, people don't like doing these things for free. So you need to pay for wood, you need to pay the people, you probably need to establish some sort of ownership of the land, whether that's militarily by conquest or just by going, we're the state, we own this land. Either way, all these things require some sort of organization. They're not usually set up by Bob because they feel like it. As a rule, Bob just saying they want to isn't going to set up a lighthouse or a beacon. Well, isn't going to set up a beacon, let alone a lighthouse, which is going to require some construction going on. So, we normally associate the development of states with the running of militaries. But with maritime states, there is the maintenance of port facilities. And there is also the maintenance of the facilities which support the ports. And one of the first things you usually find organised are beacons. So that usually you have Bob, Bobby, and Buble will go off, the three people, for a couple of weeks to man a beacon, and then they'll be replaced by Billy, Benny, and Bo, and they'll come back, home for having there a couple of weeks, and then they'll have a couple of weeks off, and then they'll go back and they'll just keep it up. With roughly 3 people there. This means that there's usually one person awake at any time during the night to tend to the fire, and there's at least a couple of people to stack the wood during the day, while that person who was on the longest night shift usually gets a bit of sleep, and someone to prepare some food, etc. You want a good way of finding out where these places used to be? Well, if you're in certain countries, mainly European ones, and you come across pubs in the middle of nowhere. Because as a rule, if you've got a space up there you're doing that, you're going to build a road to it. And then if someone else is building something further along the coast, you'll just extend that road along the coast. Alright then, well, maybe Bobby and Boobale get together and think, you know what, we can maintain this fire, but we could also build something there, so we'd have a building to go to and keep dry and warm. We made it a little bit bigger, and if people needed to stop on the way to and from, we could earn some money on the side. Now, that all works out pretty darn good. And you start using beacons and things like that, and lighthouses, to both signal where ports are, so ships can make to it in the dark, and see where it is, and also so you can warn for rocks, etc. You start to realise you need to have more than just a fire blazing. You need to have some form of differentiating this fire so people know which is a dangerous position and which is a and maybe you develop the idea of using mirrored glass or a very polished piece of bronze to make the light shine out more and focus it, because you're mathematically inclined. Now, here is the other earliest form of navigation, and for those of you who have ever, well, how do I put this politely? Driven with someone who is allergic to maps and hates to use their GPS, you will have experienced someone saying this: I navigate by dead reckoning, or I navigate by gut. As a rule, those people are actually talking twaddle because they aren't. Because there actually is a definition of navigating by dead reckoning, and it requires actually knowing where you're going to go. You see, what you do is you work out where you're going to go and you draw a line. You try and keep straight and head straight for it. And then you automatically find that unless you're in the calmest lake and it's an absolute beautiful day and everything's beautifully dry, you are not going in the right direction. Because it's like if you go in a river and you go out and you go, I want to get to the point straight ahead of me. I'm going to swim straight for that. You look up and go, I'm about 100 yards down towards the sea. Oh, sugar, the point I'm aiming for is now over there. What you need to do, therefore, is calculate that in and aim for a point. Instead of aiming straight ahead, you aim, let's say, up there. For that direction. You swim there, and you reach the point. Where you going? Great. Now, this is usually a system which sort of planes have to work to, especially because they spend more wind speed, but ships also. And then there's another scenario where your lovely lighthouses come in, because it's a case of we are sailing in that direction. That is where our finger. Sailing that way. So the lighthouse is over there. Okay, we go that way. You are trying to get from point A to point B. When the time has elapsed, that you should be at point B, you find yourself at point C. That's when you need to correct. And curious enough, you could have actually made that journey shorter by flipping it. Now, there is also another problem with dead reckoning, because as good as it can be, and as viable as it can be, there are sometimes other issues to account for, even on that beautifully straight lake. Beautifully smooth and calm lake. And that is the person at the tiller, who can't hold a tiller correctly to save their life. They are either gripping onto it with a death grip so tight that every time they strain, it's shaking the whole time, and it's having beautiful effect on its ability to work. Or they're the person who goes, "Look, no hands on the tiller, yay!" And the tiller's going click, click. Either way, the nicest way, the person who's holding it dead, you take them off the tiller and you put them in the front of the boat and you tell them to have a nice relaxing time. Don't worry, you'll look after it. The person who's going no hands while it's clicking up backwards and forwards obviously wants to go for a swim. Give them a little push, let them have a swim, and when they come back, make sure they're drying as far away from the tiller as physically possible. Make sure you don't leave them behind. It's terrible, terrible to muck up the sea that way. Right. And actually, of course, this is not no encouragement to actually push people into the water. You shouldn't. No matter how much you might fantasize or wish to or dream about it, because they should never be left in charge of a tiller, don't actually do it. Okay? YouTube, happy? Then we have loxodromic navigation. Now, this comes from Greek and basically means the oblique path. The easiest way to just take that. Now, there is an orthodromic course there as well, which is otherwise known as a great circle, and loxodromic, which is sort of the rum line. And both these methodologies of navigation are pretty standard. Now, if you navigate on a spherical surface with a fixed course, you tend to find yourself going in a spiral. This is one of the reasons why we know the Earth is round, because if you can't try to keep navigating in a straight line, you will find yourself slowly walking further and further around the Earth down. If you started, let's say, from the North Pole. Now, when you follow a rum line, you're following the curve on the surface of the Earth, and so it allows you to maintain a steady course in sailing, and it's often used as a sailing navigation technique. But again, it has to be worked out. And again, quite often, people start to talk about the other system. And the orthodromic course is otherwise known as Great Circle Navigation. Excuse me. Great Circle Navigation. I put the PowerPoints together on my laptop, and in the conversion of them to the PC, it seemed to me that the Great Circle Navigation had for some reason re-extended across the whole thing. Now, Great Circle Navigation is a lot of maths. A lot of maths. Please note, there is a tan, there is a cos, a sine, you know, well, cos of course, cosine. There are a lot of angles and working out going on, and this is the way to generate the shortest distance between 2 points on the globe. Now, again, we have it comes from a sort of a Greek phraseology, and it's all about using spherical trigonometry, which is enough maths that let's put it this way. It comes from the same branch of maths which produces the inverse geodetic problem. And at this point, it's when I start to run from the room, because there is a reason I became a historian, not a mathematician. But it's still worth me getting into a little bit of its history. Now, what happened was, when they were developing this, was they started to try and develop charts which would use this, make best use of this system. And it is a cornerstone of modern navigation, in that whilst we might use different methodologies and different systems to provide ourselves with navigation, great circle navigation is often used in terms of planning. And it's one of the reasons why, when you get to the 1900s, but certainly by the 1920s and 30s, anyone who's sitting in the back seat of an aircraft, i.e. as an observer, is not dead weight. Because observer navigators have to be able to do this maths and these sort of things without the benefit of calculators. They have some mechanical devices to their system, but now the original starting points of Great Circle Navigation do not use quite as many fun things. Believe it or not, this version is considered the more simple version. And it uses the mean Earth radius at various points. It's just so much maths, honestly. This is the point in my talk. When I give the presentation usually on navigation, I'm usually partnered up with a friend of mine who's a mathematician, and I hand it over to them. I did suggest they do a little video for my YouTube channel. Their phrase was, they are geeky enough being a mathematics professor without also being on YouTube. I'll get them. I'll get them on something at some point. So, now we come to celestial navigation, and of course, the sextant, and the chronometer. Yay! Now, this is what held sway for a very, very long time. And if you're looking at it going, Alex, that's someone with a Bonhomme Richard cap learning and using a sextant. Yes, we have started reteaching it and making sure naval personnel to know it to this day. Why? Because as much as we love the GPS system, as much as we love everything else, we have to have redundancy. Although you are welcome to be very, very afraid by the idea that if the GPS system goes down, what the frick happens to all our guided weapon systems? Think about that. you take out GPS for your opponent, they'll probably take out GPS for you. In which case, neither side will have GPS. Which can sound great. Until you realise all those long-range weapon systems, uncrewed vehicles, everything you pretty much rely on for waging warfare on a modern scale. Oh, and good luck trying to operate a modern jet fighter. The things which are designed to stay to be completely fly by computer and be completely unstable. Yeah. Theoretically, they can operate with GPS system down. They can do. But operating them for a long-range flight, as they're all single-seat aircraft, and you no longer have the person in the back seat to help with some of the navigation, that could be interesting. Anyway. Now, the celestial navigation is otherwise known as astronavigation, but I like celestial because it just sounds cooler in my mind. It takes your position using stars and, well, pretty much. Let's put it away. There are some things which we fixed on for a long time because, they must be stars. Then realize later in history, they're not stars. They're things that reflect light, but they're not stars. Ew. Okay. Now, usually, you use the sun and the moon. But I have got a friend who swears on navigating by Jupiter. I pointed out that Jupiter is not always in the night sky. You're not always able to find Jupiter, and it depends where you are exactly on the Earth and exactly when it is. But they swear whenever they see Jupiter up there, they set their navigation by Jupiter because apparently that's super accurate for them. The rest of us just do it with the moon and the sun, but occasionally wants to try and impress someone. I did try and use Mars. It went sort of okay. At the time I was 15. But you're basically doing more maths and working things out with angles. And pretty much, so you start off by fixing a point on the horizon and working out where the sun is. So you've got this point fixed on the horizon, and you're then working out where the sun is in relation to it. And that is why you see something which moves, because you're trying to angle it up so that the sun reaches about midpoint of the sun is midpoint with the horizon. And that allows you to read on that beautiful thing below the angle of difference. And use that to help work out your latitude and longitude. Especially with the help of a chronometer. Some people do try and use their own hands, and the fact that the angular width of the little finger is usually roughly 1.5 degrees elevation. So that is considered is 1.5 degrees of a sort of elevation. So it's fun to know. But I have friends who can, pretty much dead on through years of doing this, almost judge by sight without using instruments the distance and angles. but you still use the sextant because there is being pretty on and there is being right. And pretty on can still get you hitting rocks. Being right is still going to be within a margin of error, but it's going to be a much smaller margin of error. And we have satellite navigation. And this is basically the idea of us putting up, I would argue it's always kind of like artificial stars. So when you're doing the system using a sextant, you're measuring it off the sun in daytime as a rule. You might use it off various things like a lighthouse, etc., if you can, to give yourself other points of bearing. All nice to do. When you've got one choice, though, that's what you have to keep to. And then at night, you can use different stars if you want to. You know them, you study them, you can use different stars. So you can conversely almost navigate more accurately during the night than the day, because you can get more points of bearing. If you're sure those are the star, or that's the star you're looking for, and you know which star it is. Again, this learning and experience. But to make life easier, why not launch artificial stars? That is what these satellites are. That is what geostationary and the various heights and altitudes of our satellites are for. You have many of those. They are on a constant rotation around the Earth's surface. And the more of those you can get the signal off, the better. This is why, if you're looking at modern systems, quite a lot of modern systems take not just from GPS, but might also take from Galileo and GPS. Because again, it allows you to get more points of bearing. And the more you have, the more accurate you can be. Because let's put it this way, you've got 2 points. That's 2. Okay, so you're probably there. But if you can get a third, going through, and maybe a 4. Trying to do this at different angles. Yeah. Suddenly you've got a far better fix on where you are. You can be really, really precise. And again, this is coming in. Why? Because we need precision. If you want to do something like this, the most accurate form of great circumnavigation, you need as much precision as you can possibly get to create the shortest possible route, the most efficient route, the most financially efficient route. There's also the fact that the safest route is what you're looking for. And that's again the most accurate route, because it allows you to avoid not only rocks, etc. when you need to, but you can perhaps avoid them so long away, in so much availability from the great enough distance, that you never even need to notice them. If you know there are rocks and know exactly how far away they are, you can take preventive measures when you just need to do this on the wheel, rather than help. And by the way, when you do see someone doing with the wheel, grab onto something, because if you're on a sailboat, the odds are it's going to start going, yeah. When you find out it's because they were trying to avoid a dolphin. You can tell them that dolphins are a traditional symbol of being able to navigate. And B, you can tell them that dolphins will usually get out the way a long time before you bash into them. As a rule, if you're sailing in a sailing boat, if you're on a speedboat, there is a different circumstance. But if you're sailing in a sailboat, as a rule, the dolphin will get out of the way. They're fairly smart. We also have, of course, inertial navigation. Very important. This is a ring laser gyroscope. And by watching the very, very minor variations and movement in it, by the angles it moves to sort of displace and keep itself constant, the system is able to work out where you're moving, how far you're going. There are various forms of it. You know, I've got a similar sort of system you will have in most Fitbits. And, because, seriously, please tell me no one's paying for the GPS connected Fitbit. Why do you need that level? Why do you need GPS in your watch? It's just your exercise watch. If you're going up mountains of foreign and fancy schmancy expeditions, fine. Get the GPS watch. But if you're just going for a jog in the gym. But inertial navigation has become more and more important as we started navigating in places where you can't get external fixes, i.e. submarines. There's also missiles operating in denied environments, and often inside of aircraft and other systems as well, we will have an inertial navigation system. Now, the thing about inertial navigation is it's accurate to a point, but it loses accuracy the further it gets away from its starting location, its known location. So if you have the ability to occasionally stick your mast up above the water, or as high in the water as you need to be to get a GPS fix or some sort of fix like that, your inertial navigation suddenly becomes a lot better. And the more of those points you collect, the more your inertial navigation compares its movement between those points, the more accurate the system itself can get, especially some of the modern systems which will learn. They'll learn themselves, they'll learn you. It comes better. It refines itself. And before someone starts going out, that's AI! It's not AI. That is advanced programming. It looks at a difference between its own inertial point positioning and the positioning it gets from the GPS and goes, okay, I was off by this much. Laser systems are especially useful today. They are probably the most advanced system we have coming in that's being developed. There are systems which are using fiber optics and systems which are using quartz and all sorts of fun things. But at the moment, in terms of pragmatic usability, ring laser gyroscopes are pretty high up there. And pretty darn useful. Again, I should use the exact phrase, but the same phraseology turns up as when you're using dead reckoning, because it is a form of dead reckoning, in that we start talking about drift rate. But with inertial navigation, the drift rate is usually measured in terms of let's put it this way, with dead reckoning and not really thinking it through, your your drift rate can be measured in meters per second. Inertial navigation is very rarely that massively out, unless it is incredibly badly calibrated. But again, that's why you do checks with, to make sure you do have an idea where you're going. Oh. So, the other point in navigation, this is one which I always cover at the end. Natural navigation. Human beings as their own navigation tools. I sit there and go, ooh, the wind's coming at me. Always blows from the east. So that means that must be west. Yeah, that sort of thing. Humans have a lot of abilities. They also have the ability to get lost quite easily. Natural navigation in humans and many of our early navigation techniques are basically things which enhance already existing skill sets and capabilities, rather than providing something which is completely new. It's as time has gone on, and our systems and our understanding of systems and our systems of systems have developed, we've extrapolated these systems further. I.e., satellite navigation is celestial navigation with artificial stars, rather artificial points of light. Inertial navigation is a version of dead reckoning that is trying to tell you where you are so you can work out where you're going based on where you've been and the movement and the fear and the probable movements you've done since that point. All these are advanced systems, all these are useful systems. And they're going to continue to develop. That's the thing about navigation, is it's going to continue to develop. I would think the next great big evolution of navigation we're going to get is, well, we've already got systems which can maintain ships in the same spot thanks to azimuth thrusters and a good GPS system to within a meter in a storm. But I wouldn't be surprised if we get some more advanced navigation systems soon in terms of navigation management more than the actual systems of navigation. Question. I'm so dumb to ask. Which other cool thing was spoiled by the sheer complexity of the maths about it? No. Have you heard of any other forms of navigation? I know some people when I start talking about this, tend to bring up going, well, what about pigeon navigation? Yeah? What do you mean by pigeon navigation? Well, I heard that someone once strapped a pigeon to a board, and whichever way the pigeon was pointing, that was the direction they were supposed to be going, because a pigeon you had to fly home. So they're going, if the pigeon is strapped to a board, it can't be flying anywhere, can it? And as a rule, even if you attach it to a string, it's going to fly to a perch. But I do not claim to have covered all the various forms of navigation there are out there. There are lots of them, and I'll be always enjoyed hearing about more. Hope you're enjoying the Key Ship series. It should be going on quite happily. And what have we got coming up next week? We have Justifying a Navy to a Continent. Alfred Thayer Mahan. That'll be cute. Thanks very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed.